I want to start now to give you a quick brief overview of Nomi Hiroshi, who you see here in a 1948 photograph, about the time a year after he wrote the story that you read for today. You see his birth dates. He was born in 1915, he died in 1991. We are now resolutely in the post-war period. After the war, he was a soldier, and this work reflects, it talks about what life was like in the years after the war. You've already read a brief summary of his life and his work in this Britannica.com site. Unfortunately, we don't have much to show you in Wikipedia, although if you go to the Japanese site, you get to see this. But let me say a few words. For one, as Donald Keenan has said of Nomi Hiroshi, he's the first voice of the post-war writers, and his is, in a sense, the first voice of the entire body of post-war literature. What does this mean? Again, he was a very powerful writer. Nomi Hiroshi was a very powerful writer, one of the first people to write so powerfully about the war experience after the war. He was a committed Marxist. He was an activist throughout his life. He was very committed to prejudicial treatment against people, to minorities and oppressed groups. He's a prolific essayist, he was a cultural literary critic, he was a social activist. His writing casts a long shadow over the literature and the writing, which is the cultural production of the 20th century. He's a major 20th century figure. His prose, which is difficult and compelling, as well as the concerns for society, provided many with an impetus to write and helped a whole generation of writers to find their voices in a tumultuous and barren time. Kurae, These Dark Pictures, is the story in 1946, a short novel available in English. It was immediately hailed as the work of a new voice, characterized by a convoluted style. Difficult work for a difficult time is how we often refer to it. It's the style that drew many of the attention of contemporary writers, but he's also representatively post-war because of the concerns and issues he raises about society, about men and women, about life after wartime, what it means to be a soldier in a post-war society. Kurae is set amidst the 1930s among student life at Kyoto University, an elite university known for its philosophical traditions. This is the first story or set of stories really records the pressures and fears of a group of students and makes clear that the political climate in which they lived, right, it was very hard to be politically active in the very oppressive Japan of the 1930s. It's one of the few stories that gives us a clear picture. He was very clear-eyed and sharp-witted and sharp-tongued, sharp-penned in his ways of talking about what it meant to be a student who was an activist at that time. It's a difficult work, especially with its opening section, right, which is a dense, horrific description of the monstrous bodies and sexualized landscape of a Bruegel painting, the medieval Flemish painter. And here it really contrasts the place of the individual body vis-a-vis the place of the nation. He served as a soldier in the 1940s. In 1941, he was sent as a reservist to Bataan and Corregidor in the Philippines, among the most brutal of World War II theaters, both for American soldiers and Japanese soldiers, even more so, I would like to say. In 1943, he was detained in military prison, which is, again, as a result of his activism and his insistence on free speech and access to documents and access to political speech. He was imprisoned for violating the Peace Preservation Law, which was a very strong, almost martial law fact of Japanese society at the time. He was married in 1944, but unable to return to City Hall because of his prison record, so he couldn't get the marriage or other parts of his life legally taken care of. He was quite oppressed at this point in his life. Shinku Chitai, probably his most acclaimed novel, a version of it available in English, his Zone of Emptiness, came out in 1952. Red Moon in Her Face, which you read for today, was published in 1947 in Japan and translated in 1962. And these are stories in particular, all these immediate post-war stories, there's many of them. I've just noted a few here that continue the themes that were introduced with Dark Pictures. The Kurae, stories of soldiers wounded, in many ways more spiritually wounded than bodily, right on the battlefield. There's a way to argue about this, talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and the real psychological scars that are apparent with soldiers who return to the homeland, even more than the physical scars that were so apparent in Japanese soldiers. His stories reflect a Japan that's a country of walking wounded in many ways. The war hangs over and haunts them, as it will do all of Japan. His characters are rendered helpless by the war. They're unable to form relationships. They're unable to rely on others. They're unable to get out of the prison of their own bodies. And this is one of some themes you will have read on, or will be reading in the story for today. There is no escape. There are no exits from their own selves. And so there's a very lonely, cut-off existences, which would seem to be the lesson of the war. That in a struggle for survival, no one dares trust another, and that helping other people in the very critical, very constricted lifetime of war, both in Japan and outside, sharing was often seen as tantamount to suicide. He published widely, prolifically, many novels throughout his life up to the very end that I won't go through them here, and you can find them if you wish. But just to say that he is one of the representative voices of post-war Japan, and that's why we're reading his story today.